Mariana, thank you so much. And I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk with Wes and Sekou. And of course, we're all here tonight to support first-generation college students and advocate for more diverse talent pipelines into jobs that lead to economic mobility. So Wes, let's start out with you. I mean, when we were talking earlier, you were saying how anything America needs you would ask, you are happy to do it. Why do you feel that the organization's work is so important, and why is it so important to you?
The work of America Needs You is so important to me because it works. If I think about the history of this country are people who have entered into a space and entered into a place and led on a conversation that have fundamentally made us better, right? It was people who were first generation. It was people who were first in family who found their way into the highest positions of leadership. It was a story of people who entered into a place where even though they knew that this wasn't necessarily made for them, they had people who came before them who fought and who dreamed and who were willing to bleed for the hope of them. And so America Needs You means so much to me because it's the story of my family. It's the story of so many other families about how can we find a way out of no way and how do we understand and lead with an understanding, lead with a core belief that these decisions should not be being made for us, but they should be being made by us, and that our place at that table matters.
And Sekou, Wes laid it out so nicely for you, but same question now to you as far as why you feel that the work of America Needs You is so important, and especially important to you.
Normally I would just say what he said, and that would be a perfect example. That would be the correct response. But what I'll add to it is, that bold leadership really has charted a course to provide greater opportunities. As I like to say, talent is created equally. It's the opportunity that's not. And what America Needs You has done is really focus on how you address some of these both historical and present challenges that truly impair underserved communities. And so what they've been able to do through this model is take these students, show them the art of the possible, and then put them on a pathway to career and life success.
And I'm going to stick with you then, Sekou. What do you feel specifically is the role of an organization like America Needs You in creating that equity, a more equitable country? And why are you such a big proponent of America Needs You as that resource?
I've been fortunate and privileged to see the growth when it started as New York Needs You, and then New Jersey extension, and now it's America Needs You, and has really expanded across the country. And what they have done in that expansion is maintain that proximity to understand these students and their needs and their backgrounds. And there's such a strong organization that makes it easy for corporations to partner with, for people to volunteer and be a part of the career and life success of these students. And so for me, it's important because this organization really provides the training, the mentoring, the coaching, and opportunity that will ensure that these first-generation college students can stay on that pathway and maximize their opportunity and ultimately create more inclusive growth for our economy and for our communities.
Wes, kind of the same question to you. There's been a lot of discussion lately about equality versus equity. What would you say is the role of an organization like America Needs You with creating a more equitable country?
So I think the part of the idea of creating an equitable country or creating equitable situations means which voices do you have actually involved in that conversation? Which voices do you have in there that don't just have a voice, but that have a vote? And so I think the role of America Needs You is not just simply about creating pipelines. And it's also not simply about how are we changing the trajectory of the individual or their family, but it's about how their success changes the trajectory of the country. How does their success and their participation and their involvement help to lead us all to a better place? Because the people who are there making the decisions, the people who are there who are helping to structure and place in these types of elements that are intended to making us all better, we have to understand that so many of those solutions are lying in the hearts and the minds and the souls and the genius of the type of students that America Needs You doesn't just provide, but that they funnel. And so equity in my mind in this country, fairness in my mind in this country, excellence in my mind for this country does not happen if you do not get voices like the ones that America Needs You provides at the table, leading and leading the conversation.
And Wes, staying with you just for a moment, a lot of people call it the racial reckoning. I call it the so-called. I think it's really important to actually put so-called because we really don't know just yet what the outcome is going to be of this moment. But as the events were unfolding this summer, really in particular, and now into the fall, what's been your perspective? What's your take on the so-called racial reckoning?
Well, I think my take on what we've seen this summer is we've watched how we've seen these multiple crises that have really been introduced onto our doorstep. And, the first crisis was this idea, and what ended up happening when, we had COVID-19 and we had this virus that has had absolutely catastrophic health and economic implications in our society. And I think the second piece was when we all watched on camera the fact that policing is not equitable in all communities. And we saw that when we saw what happened to Mr. George Floyd. We saw that when we saw a man who was handcuffed with his face down on the ground, who took his last breaths. And we saw his name being added to a much longer lineage of others, to include Michael Brown and Philando Castile and Freddie Gray and Walter Scott and Sean Bell and Chris Brown and Anthony Anderson and Tyrone West and Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor and Laquan McDonald and Tamir Rice and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin, and the list goes on. But I think the thing that we have noticed and seen in this is not only that this is not hyperbole, this is not exaggeration, when people are talking about the differences and the discrepancies that we are seeing within communities, oftentimes exclusively based on skin color. But I think the other thing that we've seen is that the demand for justice is not just about how are we reforming policing, but that the demand for justice is justice of all forms, that it is economic justice, and that it's health justice, and that it's environmental justice, and it's housing justice. And part of the way when I think about this reckoning is that the reckoning is not exclusively about what are we doing to making sure we are banning chokeholds or no-knock warrants, but that if we're looking at this holistic idea of justice in our society, then it needs to be holistic. We need to be able to address and understand all the various discrepancies up and down the board that exist when it comes to people of color, that exist when it comes to people who are first generation and people who are immigrants. That it happens for so many families that these barriers oftentimes for things that they are A, either not responsible for, and or B, nothing they should be ashamed of, that these barriers are real. And so I feel like the hope of this moment is that we can come to a collective understanding and a collective agreement of the fact that we cannot let this moment go by. And either A, not address it, or simply B, by thinking that addressing one component of structural injustice is enough to get us to the place that we actually want to get to.
So well said, and so important, Wes, as you did, to say their names. Sekou, your hope for this moment as we talk about this so-called racial reckoning in this country.
My hope for this moment, and I want to continue with that thought of comprehensive justice, that people look at justice, as Wes said, beyond criminal justice and see that they're intertwined. So economic justice, health justice, environmental justice. If you think about Flint, Michigan, and the water situation, that was environmental, it was economic. And so we can't look at one facet of justice. We have to think about justice across our society. And my hope is that now that we anchor beyond just one issue, but recognize that there's a racial wealth gap, that there's income inequality. And if we don't address in this moment, and I think we are uniquely positioned to do so, if we don't address some of these challenges that our society continues to face, it means we're going to have more of this unrest. It means we're going to have more challenges in our communities, challenges in our schools. And so with everyone paying attention, I'm hoping that corporations continue now to assume a leadership mantle, to leverage their resources, to truly make impact so that we can close some of these economic barriers and provide greater opportunity for more people.
And Sekou, you just kind of started touching on this, so just want to explore that a little bit more, because as head of Advancing Black Pathways, you've been at the forefront of diversity and inclusion work. Now, as companies are being held accountable by their employees and communities, what's your specific advice to those leaders? And how can we tell the difference between just lip service and what might be meaningful change?
Well, one, I'll start with the last question first. I think, the public, I think shareholders, everyone is going to hold these companies accountable. Long gone are the days where you could just make a statement and a donation. People want to see actionable change. And how do you go about actionable change? Well, one, you have to have empathy and understanding, right? Understanding, connectivity and proximity with communities to understand the issues. As we went about building out Advancing Black Pathways, we let data drive our strategy, but we also did an overlay of going into communities and understanding what do these business owners need? What do the students need? So I think how we see this as sustainable rather, and not lip service, is you see how companies go about doing this work. Things that are going to be one-off and onesie-twosies may be cute, but they're not going to drive longer-term change. So in order to make real impact in this moment, what we do is going to have to be scalable. In some cases, we may understand our own swim lane as a bank, as a tech company, as a manufacturing company, but still we should also understand what's the journey that we can travel together. And so the way we will be held accountable, I believe, as I said from the outset, is as we look at, students and investors, people won't want to come work for companies who aren't serious about making impact across these incredibly important issues. Investors will not want to invest in companies that don't create greater inclusion at their senior ranks. And so the market will hold companies accountable, and I think employees will hold companies accountable. And all of that, I hope, ultimately builds into, again, greater opportunity for more people, stronger communities as a result, greater access to capital for minority business owners, and the collective efforts across these fronts means that our economy will truly grow, and that more people will have the opportunity to pursue their American dream and actually, contribute back in any way they feel is possible.
Wes, there's a powerful quote from your book, your first book, and I just want to read that here. The other Wes Moore is a drug dealer, a robber, a murderer. I am a Rhodes Scholar, a White House Fellow, a former Army officer, yet our situations could easily have been reversed. Tell us what your first book was about and how your latest book differs.
That line was important because I felt like even as I would share the story of the other Wes Moore, which was about a young man who, around the same time that I had received the Rhodes Scholarship, and I was getting ready to head off to England, how there was also in the same newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, there's a whole series of articles about 4 guys who robbed the jewelry store, and in the process ended up killing an off-duty police officer. And I was struck by the ways that we are being defined. And the thing that really struck me about it was the more I got to know Wes, and when I first reached out to him and he reached back, and then we, for years, had this relationship, before I ended up deciding that, and someone came up to me and said, you should really write about this, was that I was amazed at how thin that line is between his life and my life. And how, as a society, we are so quick to either congratulate or to castigate without ever being able to really understand the stories behind this, without ever really being able to delve into pathways, without ever really being able to understand what gets a person to one place versus another place, and how oftentimes they are the small decisions, in many cases, that aren't even being made by that person. Or cases where a person does something that if they were in another situation or in another neighborhood, why that would be a mistake, but it didn't necessarily have to be existential. And I think about the work of the new book, 5 Days, where it's actually very much the same context, where we have these definitions of this young man, Freddie Gray, who was 25 years old and died in police custody, and immediately we saw the exact thing that happens oftentimes in all these cases, which is character assassination, which is tell us what's wrong with that person. Ignoring what actually happened in terms of the interaction between them and law enforcement, but tell us what's wrong with that person where this character assassination happens. But the reality about Freddie Gray was is that this was still a young man who was born underweight and premature and born in deep poverty, whose mother lived in deep poverty her entire life. She never made it to high school. She could not read or write. She battled addiction for much of her life, and when Freddie was born, he was already exposed to heroin. That when they moved into a house in West Baltimore, they moved into a housing project that in 2009 was cited in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead inside of their home. So this was a young man who was born premature, underweight, exposed to heroin, born into deep poverty, and lead poisoned. And by this time in his life, he's 2 years old. And the point that I wanted to stress with the book 5 Days, and also taking the reader on a journey, is helping people to understand that journeys and stories actually matter in these conversations. Pathways matter. And if we can create a real sense of promise and hope, if we can create a real point of opportunity for people to be able to grasp, then we're going to be amazed to see how people will be able to excel. But the reality is we cannot pretend like these other points and these other destiny points do not matter. They do matter. And we also can't pretend that simply lifting up the exception is going to be enough to be able to keep us from breaking through some of these other societal and structural challenges. That's the thing that I wanted people to understand, is that even when you think about the support for America Needs You, this is about much more than just supporting an individual student. This is actually the idea of building up an entire new infrastructure about the way we are thinking about our society and the pathways we are providing to our young people.
Just to jump in, because I just love that the story and the story of the two Wes Moores really highlights the challenge in our society. And that is your zip code really has a bigger determinant of your ability to be successful, because it drives the type of schools you have, the tax infrastructure. We just opened a Chase branch in Cherry Hill in Baltimore. It's the first bank in the history of the city in that neighborhood. So these impoverished neighborhoods have banking deserts, food deserts, and so it's constant, inferior schools oftentimes, dilapidated schools. And so to your point, you have to rely on just the one exceptional example versus taking the step back and investing in these underserved communities and providing greater opportunities for these underserved students. And so that's, I think, one of the critical things. Back to your question about, will this reckoning be something, so-called reckoning? I think the progress to be made really requires us to make sure that the birth lottery isn't the sole determinant of your ability to be successful in this country.
Sekou, curious to see what changes you've seen in your works at Advancing Black Pathways and Robinhood as a result of COVID-19.
So before the pandemic started, we knew that Black individuals and small businesses really had fewer resources at their disposal to withstand the financial shock of COVID-19. And so as a result, we saw close to 500,000 Black businesses close this year, and some of them may never open again. And why is this important? Well, small businesses really are the top employers in the country. They employ more than half of all workers. And if you think about the Black community, these businesses are really the engine to wealth creation in the Black community. And so we saw, whether it was consumers or businesses, they were starting with less and impacted more and in a greater fashion. So one of the things we had to do was quickly pivot to think about how we could deliver information and content and support, to people who needed it. And so some of the things we did, we continued to host our ABP Apprentice program, and we paid our students for the entire summer, despite shortening their actual internship. we doubled down on financial health by making more information virtual. But we also made information available so people knew their options of what they could do if they were facing a financial hardship. And in particular, we actually launched a financial hardship fund to help students at HBCUs deal with some of the economic challenges. We launched it in February, and little did we know we would end up helping 600 students just make it home, and in partnership with Delaware State, helping to house another 600 students. So whether it was our Advancing Black Entrepreneurs effort, really launched to help these businesses survive, revive, and ultimately, we hope, thrive post the COVID era, or even what we've done with our Career Readiness series, where we provided, in partnership with LinkedIn, 6 series talking about where we're still hiring, what students should do no matter where you're working as you enter into this virtual world. You may be entering your first job virtually. How do you reinvent your career during these transformative times if you don't have a job? And so we've tried to just make more content available and make sure we're promoting it so that people have access and understand what the resources are available to them, whether they're students or business owners.
Wes, curious, in the midst of this pandemic, what your one piece of advice, your greatest piece of advice would be for our fellows who, many of whom, along with Americans just in general, are feeling depressed, are feeling anxious about this particular time. What would you suggest to help our fellows as they try to move forward and advance toward their goals?
Well, one thing I would tell them, and then the other piece of advice, first of all, I would tell them that you are so much more than worthy. You are not where you are because of someone's benevolence. You're not where you are because of someone's kindness. You're not where you are because of someone's social experiment. You're where you are because you belong there. You're where you are because everywhere you are would be incomplete if you weren't there. And I think about the piece of advice, actually, I got it, and I still live by it from my grandparents. Before I left for Afghanistan, they actually gave me a little Bible that it was small, and I kept it inside the breast pocket of my flak vest before I went on missions. And inside the Bible, they just wrote the words, "Have faith, not fear." Mm-hmm. And I think that's the piece of advice that I would give, because that's a piece of advice that I know that I still live by every single moment. I used to say that before every mission. I used to say to myself, have faith, not fear, have faith, not fear, have faith, not fear. And this is a very scary time for people because uncertainty is scary. And what people were told might not be real right now. The things that you were promised might not be necessarily promised anymore. The thing that I would say is, and the advice that I would give you, is as you're walking into these new times, have faith, not fear, because in many ways that will be what will carry you over to the next side.
And I think what you hit on too about feeling worthy, a lot of times people, it seems like, that would be intuitive, but a lot of times people have a hard time accepting that. And I love that. And that's a shorter way of thinking about it. I always think about Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, saith the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. But I'm not going to preach. We're not going to have church in here, Sekou. All right, Sekou, same advice. Same question to you, some advice that you might have during the time of the pandemic.
I think he covered, but what I'll just say is, yes, I'll acknowledge we are in one of the most challenging job markets. But even with that, you still have the opportunity to set yourself up for current longer-term success, and longer-term success. Some of the things I would just encourage you to do is continue to be aggressive, like in your internship and job search, and be sure to cast your net as far and wide as possible. Tune in to our Career Readiness series with LinkedIn. We talk about a lot of these topics over 6 sessions. And so whether, again, jobs, how to create a LinkedIn profile, and that's another good piece of advice. Make sure that you are controlling the things that you can control. And some of those things are your LinkedIn profile or how you present yourself across your social media. And so make sure your profile is up to date. Use this time to really understand, like, what are your passions and interests, like how you pitch and have your elevator pitch when you do have the opportunity to speak with people. And so I also would say, be patiently aggressive, right? So, don't, email the same person 100 times, but don't wait, for one response before you cast the wider net in terms of understanding what opportunities may be available. And then as you think about, the fact that some employers have slowed hiring, understand your pivot. Think about some of the directions that you would want to go in. And then as you can, pursue, insights, be educated on, that particular industry. During COVID-19, a lot of companies, even universities, put information online. They gave you access to free classes online. So I would say be diligent in understanding what are these online resources that help broaden your perspective and give you deeper insights so that you could then be prepared as you take this journey and understand your story and how you match that with where you ultimately want to be. And so don't give up is what I will say. It's easy, in any difficult time, especially early in your life or even later in your life, to feel overcome or overwhelmed by the moment. But if you anchor yourself on that, this is just but a moment in time, and it feels like a long moment, and we are facing difficulties, but understand that God willing, life is long. And so think about what you're going to take away from this moment that's going to make you a better professional, a better friend, a better brother or sister or sibling. So look for these opportunities to learn, even in these difficult times, so that you can emerge stronger and more prepared to really tackle the best that's yet to come for you.
Amen. Of course, for everything, there is a season. And look, I think you have a second act here. You can take this on the road as motivational speakers. I feel enlightened and inspired. So God bless you both. And thank you so much for your time and your insight.
I carry his books typically, both of them, or three of them now, and I just hand them out. So I get the knowledge from Wes myself. So
faith over fear. All right. Thank you guys so much.